My most recent article for New Eastern Outlook is titled US War on China is a war on the entire world. And I'm trying to make a point that many people who follow geopolitics have their areas of interest. People are sometimes so overly obsessed with a particular conflict anywhere on the globe, to the point where they do not zoom out and see how it fits into the rest of what's happening around the world. They don't understand that it's just one small part of a much wider struggle. Sometimes they believe that the conflict that they're obsessed with is the only struggle, the only primary struggle, and everything else is just at its periphery or just coincidentally unfolding as well. Somehow in their minds they isolate it all, but in reality all of this is connected. Every conflict, every major conflict around the globe is part of a singular, long-standing, long-running US foreign policy objective, what many people call the Wolfowitz doctrine, but what is essentially modern-day imperialism. The US wants to maintain American primacy over the entire planet by identifying, undermining, and eliminating all potential or existing peer or near-peer competitors. That is a reality. This is something that has been admitted for decades, since the end of the Cold War, and it is something the US has been openly pursuing all around the world, whether it's conflicts across the Middle East, the ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, and the escalating tensions we see here in the Asia Pacific, where I am based. So let me read through this article and let me help explain how this war that the US is engineering against China is actually a war against the entire planet. It is a war that will directly affect and hurt everyone on Earth if it does eventually unfold. And so this is something that I think people should understand, that our following of conflicts, say in the Middle East or in Ukraine, has to be done in the context of this much wider conflict the US is engineering and hoping to provoke with China. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has recently claimed the US is not looking for a crisis.
So the PRC well understands the longstanding commitment the United States has under its Mutual Defense Treaty to the Philippines, and the Philippines well understands that we have an ironclad commitment to support them in their lawful exercise of their rights, their maritime rights. At the same time, nobody is looking for a crisis, not the Philippines, not the United States, and we hope not the PRC. But I did raise our concerns about some of the destabilizing actions that have taken place, including the ramming of Coast Guard vessels and unsafe intercepts near Scarborough Shoal.
This is said, of course, with an important caveat. No crisis is sought as long as China subordinates itself to the United States. And this extends to all other nations the US finds itself in conflict with. Of course, it will say, we don't want a conflict with Russia. If Russia just did what we told them to do, if they just subordinated themselves to us, they just opened up their country to us and allowed us to strip mine it, there would be no need for conflict. If you read between the lines, that is what they're actually saying. That's what they're saying in regards to Russia. That's what they're saying in regards to Iran. That is what they are saying in regards to China. Because China, like any other sovereign nation based on international law, is obligated to resist foreign subordination, the US continues speeding toward inevitable war with China. Because China obviously, clearly, is not going to subordinate itself to the United States. Why would it? Why should it? Although China has formidable military capabilities, causing doubt among many that the US will actually even trigger war with China, the US has spent decades attempting to create and exploit a potential weakness China's current military might may be incapable of defending against. So what is that weakness that the US has been working on for so many years? This is something that I have been covering since I began writing about geopolitics all the way back in 2009, 2010. So let's take a look at just how long-standing this foreign policy of containing China is, and let's see how it fits in with America's global geopolitical objectives. Far from the recent policy shift by the Biden administration, U.S. ambitions to encircle and contain China stretch back to the end of World War II. Even as far back as 1965, as the US waged war against Vietnam, US documents referred to a policy to contain communist China as long-running and identified the fighting in Southeast Asia as necessary toward achieving this policy. So of course I'm talking about this document that I pointed out many times before. It's a memorandum from then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to then US President Lyndon B. Johnson. This was 1965. Courses of action in Vietnam, and it says military operations against northern Vietnam only make sense if they are in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. So all the way back in 1965, it was already a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And then it talks about how China poses a threat to the United States because it prevents the US from influencing and controlling the entire planet, basically. And then it also talks about the various fronts the United States operates this strategy of encirclement along. So one is Japan and Korea. Again, remember, this is 1965. Today, there are tens of thousands of US troops in Japan and South Korea containing China in the north and northeast. India and Pakistan. I've talked about this extensively, how even though the US may not have huge military bases in Pakistan or India, we just watched the US overthrow the government in Bangladesh. This was to undermine India. And I've talked about how for many years now, the US has backed armed militants in Baluchistan and southwest Pakistan to directly attack joint Chinese-Pakistan infrastructure projects, the Gwadar port and the China-Pakistan economic corridor that runs from the port all the way to China itself. How these armed militants backed by the US literally attack Chinese engineers and kill them, as well as the Pakistani security that are trying to protect them. So this is something that the US is doing there in India and Pakistan. And of course, the other front is Southeast Asia. Back then, the US was literally waging war across Southeast Asia. It had military facilities here in Thailand, where I am based. It was waging war against Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, had a military presence in the Philippines. It still has a military presence in the Philippines. It is now an expanding military presence in the Philippines, and all of this is to encircle and contain China. The United States is creating a conflict with China and then using that conflict as justification to expand its military presence vis-a-vis China. For decades, the US has waged wars of aggression along China's periphery, engaged in political interference to destabilize China's partners, as well as attempt to destabilize China itself, as well as pursued likewise long-running policies to undermine China's economic growth and its trade with the rest of the world. More recently, the US has begun reorganizing its entire military for inevitable war with China. And I'm going to get into that. This BBC article, How US Marines Are Being Reshaped for China Threat. The US Marine Corps used to be a combined arms force. It had air power, sea power, land power. Had all the elements required to fight a war in all of these domains. And the US has been stripping it of these capabilities and assigning it solely to wage war against China in Asia Pacific, and particularly aimed at attacking Chinese shipping. And I'll get into the details of that here in just a moment. In addition to fighting Chinese forces in the Asia-Pacific region, the US also has long-running plans to cut off Chinese trade around the globe. And this is actually the centerpiece of US strategy toward China. You can see a gradual realization in Washington, in the Pentagon, that a US military conflict with China off Chinese shores is going to go very poorly for the United States. So they have been devising a strategy to attack China's weakness. What is China's weakness? We're told that China is this giant and growing threat to the entire globe. But what is admitted in every single US policy paper is that the Chinese military is not stretched all around the globe like the US military is. The Chinese military exists to defend China and to defend China only. Its military forces are incapable of projecting power around the globe. The Chinese military is not even developing the capabilities necessary to project power around the globe. And the US takes advantage of this. The plan is yes, we will try to attack and disrupt Chinese forces as much as possible off of China's own shores, disrupt their shipping as close to China as possible. But because the US military is stretched all around the globe, we can attack Chinese shipping all around the globe and China will be powerless to stop us. They simply do not have the global military presence we do to defend their own shipping. And this is something that they have been working on for many, many years. So let's take a look at that. In 2006, the US Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute published a paper titled String of Pearls, Meeting the Challenge of China's Rising Power Across the Asia Littoral, identifying China's essential sea lines of communication from the Middle East to the Strait of Malacca as particularly vulnerable and subject to US primacy over Asia. Because the paper, even back in 2006, recognized that the US by far has the largest military presence in Asia, despite not even being located in Asia. The paper argues that US primacy, and in particular its military presence across the region, could be used as leverage for drawing China into the community of nations as a responsible stakeholder. This is a euphemism for subordinating China to US primacy. This, in turn, is in line with a wider global policy seeking to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. And that is this old New York Times article from 1992. At the end of the Cold War, US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. That means not Russia re-emerging and not China rising. And again, it's talking all about maintaining American primacy over the entire planet and using military force to do so. I highly suggest people read that article. A link to it will be in the video description below. That is US policy. That is what it has been since the end of the Cold War up to and including now, regardless of who controls US Congress and no matter who is in the White House. And that includes whoever wins the US presidential election this November. It does not matter. Every single president, including President Trump, of course, Biden, Obama, and if Kamala Harris wins, Kamala Harris herself, they will continue pursuing this policy. As a matter of fact, they all openly vow to continue pursuing this policy of ensuring American primacy over nations like Russia and China, including Trump, including Vance. Under a section titled Leveraging US Military Power, so this is in the SSI paper, String of Pearls, Meeting the Challenge of China's Rising Power Across the Asia Littoral. The paper argues for an expanded US military presence across the entire region, including along China's sea lines of communication, augmenting its existing presence in East Asia, so that means South Korea and Japan, but also extending it into Southeast Asia and South Asia, recruiting nations like Indonesia and Bangladesh to bolster US military power over the region and thus over China. We just watched the US overthrow the government in Bangladesh. The ousted prime minister swears that this was because she refused to allow the US to build a military base inside Bangladesh's territory. And of course, we're watching the US having politically captured the Philippines, expand its military presence there, and encourage the Philippines to wage a Ukraine-style proxy war against China on Washington's behalf. It notes Chinese efforts to secure its sea lines of communication, including with a mutually beneficial port project in Pakistan's Balochistan region, part of the larger China-Pakistan economic corridor, and the construction of a port in Myanmar, part of the larger China-Myanmar economic corridor. Both projects seek to create alternative economic lines of communication for China, circumventing the long and vulnerable sea route through the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea that the US is clearly militarizing and attempting to compromise freedom of navigation through. We always hear that the US is placing its military, its Navy in particular, all across Asia Pacific to protect freedom of navigation. But in fact, it is to threaten it. The US is the greatest threat to freedom of navigation anywhere in the world, including China's sea lines of communication through the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. Both projects, so the economic corridors in Pakistan and Myanmar, both projects have since come under attack by US-backed militancy, with regular attacks still taking place against Chinese engineers across Pakistan and large-scale armed conflict backed by the US currently unfolding in Myanmar, which regularly sees opposition forces target Chinese-built infrastructure. I've been covering these attacks for years, and I link to some of the most recent attacks which have occurred this year. So we have this from CNN. This was March this year. Chinese workers killed in suicide bomb blasts. Pakistan grapples with attacks on Beijing's interests. So the US is backing militancy in Pakistan to attack joint projects with China, infrastructure projects, targeting and killing Chinese engineers, the Pakistani security forces trying to protect them. And here's an article from the Irrawaddy, which is funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy as opposition propaganda for the opposition groups in Myanmar. They're talking about the People's Defense Force, that's what PDF stands for, sees guard posts for Chinese pipeline facilities in Myanmar's Mandalay region. Do you see a pattern developing here? How wherever the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative goes to try to create alternative economic lines of communications, to protect against the US cutting its sea lines of communication in the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea. The US is standing up militants, terrorists essentially, destabilizing, politically capturing nations working with China to cut off all of these alternative economic lines of communication. The US is already we heard Jake Sullivan say he does not want a crisis with China. The US is already in crisis with China. It is already in conflict with China via proxies to maintain plausible deniability. But the US is essentially killing Chinese engineers and attacking Chinese infrastructure around the globe already, and has been doing so for years, from Bush Jr. to Obama to Trump to Biden, and again, regardless of who wins in November, it will continue. Thus, US policy has sought and has since achieved the region-wide disruption of China's sea lines of communication, as well as efforts to circumvent those choke points. So again, the economic corridors in Pakistan and Myanmar. Other potential corridors, including through the heart of Southeast Asia, have also been targeted by US interference. The Thai section of the Chinese high-speed rail project to connect Southeast Asia to China has been significantly delayed by the US-backed political opposition openly trying to cancel the project. And I have talked about this often. We remember the Oslo Freedom Forum, which constantly has to rebrand because people realize that it's essentially a US government front. Training, equipping, backing opposition groups to overthrow their respective governments. So who is mentioned here? A look back at the 2020 Oslo Freedom Forum, Human Rights Foundation, Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit. This is the billionaire opposition leader of the opposition forces here in Thailand. He's one of 2 billionaires backed by the US. And what did he do? He literally came out and said, Thailand needs Hyperloop, not China-built high-speed rail. And they're calling Thanathorn a junta critic. And what he was saying was that Thailand should cancel the already under construction high-speed rail line with China. The line through Laos is already completed and in operation and very successful. And there are already Thai businesses trying to find a way to connect with it before the Thai section is completed. He wanted to cancel the Thai-Chinese high-speed rail project and instead build the Hyperloop. He went to the United States to see the Hyperloop project while it was being developed. That project has since been shuttered. It no longer is in operation. It's been completely closed down. It has been a complete and absolute failure. So what was Thanathorn actually doing? This US-backed billionaire running the US-backed opposition here in Thailand. What was he trying to do? He was trying to simply stop the development of infrastructure, to stunt development here in Southeast Asia, and also cut off and isolate China. The same process the US has put in motion in Ukraine, politically capturing Ukraine, irrationally cutting off Ukrainian cooperation with Russia, destroying its economy, and then shaping it into a proxy to be used militarily against Russia at the expense of Ukraine's own existence. This is the plan the US has for every country it targets, with varying degrees of progress and success, but it is the same plan nonetheless from country to country, including here in Thailand and including the Philippines. The Philippines, where the US is having much more success and moving much more rapidly, has already canceled joint infrastructure projects with China, redirected public funds to military spending so that the Philippines can buy missiles from the US and point them at China, China being the Philippines' largest, most important trade partner. You could see the theme, the reoccurring theme regarding US interference in all of these countries and what the point of this interference aims to achieve. It is to encircle and contain and eliminate all peer and near-peer competitors, as per the 1992 Pentagon strategy as reported by the New York Times. The strategy ensuring no rivals develop. That is what all of this is, all connected. It is all the same process, and people need to zoom out and see this bigger picture and understand how all of this fits together. In many ways, the US has already created a crisis for China, albeit through proxy. So that's what I was explaining. It's already attacking Chinese interests all around the globe. It is standing up opposition groups that are fighting against China, sometimes literally killing Chinese people who are working with partner nations to build infrastructure around the globe. So let's talk more specifically about targeting Chinese maritime shipping. I just explained, I gave you a brief preview of how the US is attacking the alternative networks that China is developing to circumvent vulnerabilities in maritime shipping. One thing I just want to point out to people, if you go to my channel on YouTube, there's a search bar here, and if you type in Myanmar, China, and you type it in, you will see all the videos that I have put out covering all of these attacks and how the United States is interfering in Myanmar specifically to isolate and contain China. And if you type in Pakistan, you will see all the videos that I published regarding attacks on Chinese infrastructure in Pakistan. So I have been covering this for years. There's hundreds of articles and videos out there that I have written or produced covering this topic. If you want more information, use that search bar on my YouTube channel to find those videos. So now let's talk about targeting Chinese maritime shipping. Under the guise of protecting freedom of navigation, the US Navy has positioned its warships and military aviation around the world's most important maritime passages, including the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East and the South China Sea. The east approach to the Strait of Malacca, along with plans to establish a significant naval presence on the strait's west approach. So we see the US overthrowing the government in Bangladesh. There's alleged interest that the US has in establishing a military base in Bangladesh. I've not actually seen evidence of that, but I wouldn't doubt it. It fits in with an admitted plan to do so. The US realizes that Chinese military power is extensive enough to significantly complicate, if not outright defeat, US military aggression along Chinese coasts. The US instead imagines targeting China far beyond the reach of its warplanes and missile forces. China has a huge navy, air force, and missile force. Its missile force is vastly larger than America's. Its air force and navy are comparable to US military power. And then you have to remember, the US is going to try to provoke and fight this war across an entire ocean, while China will be fighting right off its own shores. The US Naval Institute published this right here. Prize law can help the United States win the war of 2026. So keep this in mind, 2026, why are they talking about 20? That's not too far off from now. The Future of Naval Warfare essay contest. So this is the US Naval Institute, and this was an essay contest, and this was a serving US Marine Corps major who wrote this. This essay warns that a close naval blockade is infeasible due to China's formidable anti-access area denial capabilities. So China has a huge integrated air defense network. It has electronic warfare, has all of these capabilities that we see Russia using to defeat Western-made weapon systems. The most sophisticated Western-made weapon systems are being mitigated by these Russian capabilities. China shares many of these same capabilities, and in some ways it exceeds Russian capabilities. Instead, the essay argues, and this is a direct quote from the paper, it argues for a distant blockade, intercepting Chinese merchant shipping at key maritime choke points outside China's A2AD reach, so outside its air defenses, outside of the reach of its missile, naval, and air forces. This would be generally sustainable flexible in tempo and location, impose manageable risks of escalation, and impede China's resource-hungry, import-dependent war effort. And they're not saying it directly, but the whole point of this is to cripple and collapse China economically. Cut off its maritime shipping globally, collapse China economically. That is their strategy. China knows about this. We've seen recent headlines. This is from the US government, arms industry, and other big business funded policy think tank Council on Foreign Relations. China's stockpiling mobilization measures for competition and conflict. China's stockpiling all of these commodities, and there's many explanations as to why they're doing this, but there's a stated US policy planning on targeting and cutting off Chinese maritime shipping worldwide. If China is aware of this, and surely they are, stockpiling commodities would be one of the many measures it could take to mitigate the impact of this US strategy. So let's continue. Part of this distant blockade would be a campaign of targeting, seizing, and repurposing Chinese shipping vessels to augment the US's lagging shipbuilding capabilities and the dearth of maritime resources it has created. I've talked about other articles. This is another article from US Naval Institute. This was relatively recent, August 22nd, 2024. Navy could sideline 17 support ships due to manpower issues. They have manpower issues and a shortage in shipbuilding. This is creating a crisis for the US Navy. So this other essay is talking about seizing Chinese vessels during war and repurposing them because the US Navy itself doesn't have enough ships to support its own combat operations all around the globe. It's not whether or not this will work for the United States, but what I'm trying to explain and warn about is that this is US policy that they are pursuing. They are taking concrete steps to eventually carry out this policy of cutting off Chinese maritime shipping. This is their plan to stop China from surpassing the collective West, cripple China's economy by targeting maritime shipping. So let's continue. Far from a random essay representing a purely speculative strategy, the US has already taken steps to implement its distant blockade. The entire US Marine Corps has been tailored solely to wage war against Chinese shipping across the Asia Pacific and beyond. So now I get into this BBC article here that I had shown. This was from February 2023, and this is something that has already happened. The plan was to take away US Marine Corps main battle tanks, the M1 Abrams, and replace tank forces with missile forces, essentially. HIMARS, long-range, ground-launched cruise missiles, ATACMS, and other systems that are under development and incrementally finding their way into service. So the BBC article says the new plan sees the Marines as fighting dispersed operations across chains of islands. Units will be smaller, more spread out, but packing a much bigger punch through a variety of new weapon systems. The new weapon systems are primarily anti-shipping missiles. Operating on islands and in littoral regions, US Marines have been transformed into a force almost solely for disrupting Chinese shipping. So what the US Marine Corps will do is set up, say, around the Strait of Malacca or in the Philippines, or various islands near and around Japanese territory, South Korea, and they will attack Chinese shipping in and out from mainland China. Together with plans to seize Chinese vessels, as that essay was arguing for, the US has positioned itself not as a global protector of freedom of navigation, but the greatest threat to it. Now, this is why this is so important for people to understand. It's not just a US war against China for supremacy. Attacking China in this way, targeting Chinese maritime shipping, is going to destroy not just China's economy, but the entire planet's economy. Together with plans to seize Chinese vessels, the US has positioned itself not as global protector of freedom of navigation, but the greatest threat to it. Considering China's status as the largest trade partner of nations around the globe, US plans to target Chinese shipping isn't a threat only to China, but to global economic prosperity as a whole. 10, 20 years ago, many of these nations that we see working so closely with China counted the US, Japan, and Europe as their closest trade partners. Today, all of these nations, with a few exceptions, count China by far as their largest import and export partner. So if you attack Chinese shipping, you're going to be crippling the economy of all nations around the globe, not just China. In many ways, what the United States is trying to do is the same strategy we see doctors use for cancer. The cancer is infecting your body, and they use chemo to poison your whole body, hopefully to target and kill the cancer before the chemo kills your whole body, kills you. That is the strategy the US is using. They're going to target, attack, destroy the global economy, hopefully strangling China out of existence. And then even though it's going to weaken and sicken itself economically, it believes, and you can see this through its concerted strategy of decoupling from China, managing risks, trading with China, you can see it trying to create an independent economic structure that it could use to rebuild in the ashes of this war that it is seeking to provoke. This is extremely dangerous. I see hardly anyone talking about this, but this is clearly what the US is doing. They are reorganizing their entire military to carry out this strategy. The danger of Washington's desire for war with China and implementing its distant blockade to strangle China's economy into ruins is a danger for the entire world. While preventing the global economic damage this strategy will cause after it is put into motion may be impossible, targeting the various components the US is using to encircle and contain China ahead of this conflict is possible. US political interference and the political as well as armed opposition it has created and is using to cut China's various economic lines of communication can be exposed and uprooted by national and regional security initiatives. Securing national and regional information space is the simplest and most effective way to cut the US off from the populations it seeks to influence and turn against targeted nations to achieve the political and security crises it uses to threaten trade between China and its partners. America's superweapon is still its propaganda, its ability to infect a nation's population, their perception, to turn them against their own best interests, to divide and destroy their own country, to attack their own strongest allies, offering them the most prosperous options for international relations into the future. The United States is spending billions every single year in every single country along China's periphery to poison the people in those countries against China. A lot of the comments that I read in my comment section of my many videos that I put out will say, Brian, you're doing a great job on Ukraine. You're one of the best analysts out there when it comes to Ukraine, but you're completely wrong about China. And then they list off verbatim US State Department talking points regarding China, just to give you an idea of how powerful US propaganda is. It even affects the minds of people who know that the US State Department is lying to them. But when it comes to China, they're still willing to repeat those lies. Protecting a nation's information space from this corrosive influence is essential. Passing and enforcing laws targeting, exposing, and uprooting US interference, including the funding of opposition parties, organizations, and media platforms by the US government's National Endowment for Democracy is also essential. This is how the US infiltrates and infects a nation. They infect its information space, academia, the legal system, the political system. They turn the nation against itself and its best interests to serve US interests at the expense of the targeted nation. We've seen it over and over again. This is how the US is creating this environment permissive for this wider war the US seeks to wage against China. And if nations start banding together and uprooting this toxic influence the US exerts over their respective countries, they can prevent this process from continuing, and they can prevent the US from even arriving at a point where they can launch this destructive war against Chinese maritime shipping. Recent moves by the US to target foreign media organizations and their alleged cooperation with American citizens has created a convenient pretext for other nations to cite when targeting and uprooting any defunded activities. The United States is right now openly waging war against Russian state media, and in particular RT. The United States globally demands that US government-funded propaganda be allowed to be broadcasted and operate inside all of these targeted countries. And if a nation tries to shut it down, they're accused of violating freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the US will target them with sanctions and increasingly drastic measures to coerce them into continuing to allow the US to infect their information space. Now the US is demanding that Russia be uprooted from its own information space. Well, if the US is allowed to uproot foreign influence from its information space, other nations should be allowed to do likewise. They're setting a precedent and freeing the hands of all of these governments who have been told that if they do this, it's in violation of free speech. Well, the US is now doing it. So it either isn't violating free speech and it is a legitimate national security concern all nations are allowed to address, or at the very least, the US has no authority to speak regarding freedom of speech because they themselves are infringing upon it within their own information space. While taking these steps will have their own consequences, including retaliation from the US itself, the alternative, allowing the US to prepare and eventually carry out its distant blockade against China and its global trade partners, which is virtually every country on Earth, will be even more consequential. A lot of these nations targeted by the US interference, resist fighting back against it because they know if they try to fight back against it, the US will take more increasingly extreme measures against that country and it will escalate toward violence. But if you've been paying attention at all, eventually the US will escalate toward violence anyway. The point is they're going to continue pressuring and coercing you until they co-opt and capture your country politically. So you can delay it for as long as you can, but the end goal for the US is always the same. And it almost always is going to end in violence, destruction, and the unraveling of the nation itself. Again, look at Ukraine. And look at what is now happening in Bangladesh. Only time will tell if the emerging multipolar world is capable of seeing and solving this future crisis the US has spent decades preparing to create, or if the potential leadership in Southeast and South Asia will fear short-time consequences at the expense of allowing and thus suffering catastrophic consequences in the intermediate future. When I say intermediate future, you saw the article yourself. They're talking about seizing Chinese ships, maritime shipping around the world, to win the war of 2026. So it's not really that far in the future. We often hear about how China is rushing to wage war against the United States over Taiwan or over the South China Sea. It's actually the US racing against time to wage war against China. Every single year that goes by, China becomes stronger relative to the United States. This is an admitted fact. The United States wants to wage this war sooner rather than later. At a certain point, even this distant blockade strategy will not be effective because China will be strong enough to weather it. Some fear maybe China is already strong enough to weather it. So we have to be aware of this. We have to understand this is not just between the US and China, because China is an economic trade partner, the most important economic trade partner of so many nations around the globe. If the United States pulls the trigger on this, they're going to collapse the entire global economy. It's going to make COVID look like a very minimum economic disruption compared to what the US plans to do here in the future. I will continue keeping an eye on this. Again, I want everyone to constantly zoom out and look at the big picture. This is US strategy. It is not focused on the Middle East. It is not focused on Eastern Europe. It is not focused on Asia Pacific or Latin America. It is focused on ensuring no rivals develop anywhere on the globe, to ensure no rivals develop anywhere on the globe. It is a global strategy. Every single conflict we see serves this strategy and has for decades. If you understand that, then you can see clearly what is driving all of these conflicts. You can see how they're all interconnected, and we can start talking about ways to expose, undermine, and resist this strategy that is going to destroy the global economy and will affect all of our lives. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of lives, billions of lives will be affected. Again, just think about how people suffered through COVID economically, and just imagine that on a greater scale. That is what we're speeding towards. This is what we need to raise awareness of and start speaking out against. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other ways you can find and follow my work. I put my videos up on YouTube, Rumble, and Telegram. I also publish all of my New Eastern Outlook articles on Telegram. The links are blocked on X for the time being. Also in the video description are all of the links that I reference in this video, as well as for ways you can support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no extra resources to spare and you're sharing my work with others, helping get the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.